How does a man who looks like he's dancing with chaos break through the walls of the UFC and seize a throne meant for the polished, the technical, the textbook perfect? From the very start, Dricus Du Plessis was a paradox, a puzzle that mocked logic. They doubted him, laughed at him, pinned him as a meme in MMA's grand theater. His footwork was jagged, his strikes looked like desperation wrapped in frenzy, and analysts sat back shaking their heads, calling him a mistake waiting to happen. But deep within that wild exterior lay something far deadlier than crisp technique, an unkillable spirit that devoured pressure and spat out flames. Dricus was never out there seeking applause. He was seeking war. When the world spiraled into panic in 2020, when empty streets and masked faces became the new normal, most men clutched safety like a fragile relic. But Dricus was forged differently. He didn't fear uncertainty, he hunted it. As the globe cowered, he sharpened his will and stepped into the UFC, not as a hopeful, but as a storm demanding to be witnessed. South African blood roared through his veins, thick with the memory of ancestors who refused to kneel. He wasn't just chasing personal triumph, he was carrying a continent's silent ache, the longing of forgotten people desperate to etch their name into the sport's immortal ledger. With each walk to the octagon, ghosts of a nation trailed him. South Africa was never whispered in the same breath as MMA royalty, but Dricus had no plans of being a silent footnote. When he faced Trevin Giles in his second UFC outing, the narrative was written with American arrogance. Giles was supposed to use Dricus as another rung on his ladder. Instead, a thunderous right hand from the so-called sloppy South African sent Giles collapsing into oblivion, leaving the world gasping. This was more than a win. It was a seismic declaration. South Africa had erupted onto the MMA map, and the tremors were only beginning. But notoriety is a blade that cuts both ways. Where many earned respect through artistic violence, Dricus gained fascination through sheer bewilderment. Commentators stammered, fans scratched their heads, analysts tried to label the tornado he brought into the cage. They watched not with admiration, but with that same dark curiosity reserved for car crashes, horrified yet unable to look away. He moved like a man chasing phantoms in a bar fight, unrefined, reckless. And yet, bodies kept dropping. His style was an insult to orthodoxy, an affront to purists, but it was undeniably real. Then came the clash with Darren Till, a bout that felt like a parable carved from contradiction. On one side stood Till, sculpted by tradition, the epitome of crisp striking. On the other, Dricus, a cyclone wearing 4-ounce gloves. By the final horn, only one man's spirit still roared. Dricus hadn't just defeated Till, he'd stolen the flame from his eyes, dragging the technician into the dark, suffocating waters and leaving him there to choke on regret. Even then, respect hovered just beyond reach. The world still clung to its disbelief, too hypnotized by the chaos to see the cold precision underneath. Outside the cage, he tried to dance the dance. Media interviews, playful jabs. The spectacle fans adored. But charm was not the tool forged in Dricus's soul. He was steel and scars, not velvet and winks. Derek Brunson was thrown his way next, a test of grit against the South African's supposed ceiling. What unfolded was another brutal dismantling. Where Brunson leaned on experience, Dricus unleashed merciless aggression. Each punch was a declaration of finality, a promise of ruin. Yet it wasn't just the fists breaking Brunson down. It was Dricus's mental siege. He walked with the calm lunacy of a man convinced the universe owed him nothing, and that made him terrifying. But beyond every highlight lay a fracture. Hidden from the world was a torment that would have broken lesser men. An injury that left his nose so battered he lived on 8% oxygen intake. Each fight was less about skill than it was about clawing for breath. Pain was his morning prayer, struggle his daily bread. Still, he offered no excuses, no pleas for sympathy, until the day he finally sought to breathe as other warriors did. Surgery followed, and when he emerged from that table, he was not the same. This was not a man healed, it was a man reborn, lungs afire with fresh oxygen, eyes alight with overdue clarity. With this new engine under his ribs, his sights turned to Robert Whittaker, the division's Shadow King, the boogeyman who haunted every contender, not named Adesanya. Analysts dismissed Dricus outright. Fans laughed, calling him an inevitable corpse. They didn't account for evolution. Dricus stepped into the cage that night not as the gasping brawler of old, but as a predator fully awakened. When the dust settled, Whitaker lay dismantled, his aura of invincibility shattered. The man mocked for his clumsiness now stood baptized in Whitaker's ruin, and for the first time, respect wasn't withheld. It was reluctantly offered, grudging but undeniable. The aftermath was wildfire. Victory over Whitaker transformed Dricus from curiosity into prophecy. The doubters began to waver, their snickers morphing into uneasy silence. Yet amidst the celebration, another storm brewed. Israel Adesanya, regal, technical, Africa's golden sun, loomed large. But to Dricus, titles alone weren't enough. You didn't represent Africa by bloodline alone. You had to breathe its dust, feel its sun burn your back. He branded himself the true African champion, and with those words, he didn't just spark controversy, he detonated it. A new war line was drawn between lineage and lived legacy. Fans polarized instantly. Some hurled accusations of ignorance, branding Dricus as blind to the deeper ties that bound all Africans. Others cheered, hungry for his raw nationalism. Controversy proved a golden elixir in this savage sport, sending Dricus's stock soaring. Even the stoic Adesanya cracked, spitting venom rarely seen from the usually unflappable champion. The battle turned intensely personal, a theater of national pride and private wounds. Yet the octagon remained elusive. While Adesanya sat on his throne, Dricus kept clawing, stacking 5 wins without that elusive title shot. Critics still groped for logic in his style, mistaking raw genius for sloppy accident. Beneath all this turbulence lay an invisible ballast: sacrifice. Fans saw the hands raised, the belts lifted, but not the hospital bills, the 4 a.m. trainings, the bruised memories of a childhood carved by hard realities. They didn't see how each victory was built on inhaling agony and exhaling resolve. When his chance finally came, fate intervened cruelly. Injuries snatched the showdown with Adesanya away, replacing it with a specter no one had anticipated: Sean Strickland, a ghost from MMA's fringes who rose by dismantling Adesanya himself in a seismic upset that flipped the kingdom on its head. Strickland was no mere accident in history. Where Dricus fought like a hurricane, Strickland battled with a haunting madness. He was less a technician and more a live wire, uncoiling in dangerous unpredictability. Their destinies collided under the bright lights of press conferences, where Dricus showed he could dismantle more than just bodies. He could tear into psyches. He dug surgical fingers into Strickland's deepest scars, speaking casually of childhood horrors and paternal cruelty. Fans squirmed at the cold precision of his words, mistaking ruthlessness for malice. But Dricus understood the grim truth of combat. In war, emotions are weapons, and he wielded them with eerie calm. He didn't want to just defeat Strickland. He aimed to fracture something inside him. By the time they stepped under the Canadian arena's glaring lights at UFC 297, the air buzzed with an electricity that bordered on spiritual. Strickland may have worn the belt, but Dricus carried a certainty that transcended gold. For 25 savage minutes, they collided like planets destined for ruin. Strickland absorbed monstrous shots with that eerie grin, but Dricus refused to fade. Fueled by new lungs, old grudges, and a hunger that could swallow worlds, he stalked forward, a bloody juggernaut unwilling to yield. When the final bell pierced the chaos, they stood battered yet unbroken. And as the scorecards were read, history pivoted again. Dricus Du Plessis was no longer the man chasing destiny. He was destiny itself, draped in South Africa's roar. The mockery that once shadowed his every swing dissolved like fog under a brutal sun. Critics had no clever retorts left. The man once laughed at for throwing wild punches now stood as emperor of the middleweights. But MMA crowns are never gentle rewards. They are anvils strapped to your shoulders, each jewel a target for hungry challengers. And as cameras flashed and fans lost their voices, an old ghost stirred. Israel Adesanya, unbowed, unbroken by past defeats, re-emerged not as a friend, not as a neutral witness, but as a hunter who believed the throne was rightfully his. The tension snapped back into place like a taut wire. The war that had begun with barbed words and national pride was rekindled, fiercer and more poetic than before. This wasn't just two fighters vying for supremacy. It was two towering myths, each embodying the dreams, scars, and contradictions of a continent that had long waited for its own heroes. Contracts signed, dates sealed, UFC 305 transformed from an event into a reckoning. The pre-fight build-up blurred lines between theater and therapy. Dricus, ever the cold blade, sliced through questions with sharp disdain. Adesanya let layers peel back, speaking of family wounds, misread loyalty, and a legacy constantly dissected by outsiders. Press conferences turned into war zones of philosophy and pain. Fans watched, torn between these avatars of conflicting African identities, both sons of the same soil, yet molded by wildly different fires. What had started as a war of flags evolved into a collision of human frailties, old traumas repackaged into bravado. By the time fight night arrived, arenas pulsed with an anticipation that felt biblical. When the cage door locked, it wasn't just steel enclosing flesh. It was history daring them to settle a score that had simmered through generations. Their battle was less a fight and more an unrestrained opera of violence. Adesanya flowed like a poem written in blood, each step a stanza of calculated destruction. But Dricus had become something else. An orchestra of disciplined chaos, a symphony composed from every moment he was ever doubted. Every time pain was his only teacher. As Adesanya's rhythm faltered for a heartbeat, Dricus didn't hesitate. He stormed forward, wrapping fate around Adesanya's neck with a guillotine that was more than a submission. It was the final sentence on a saga. When Adesanya's hand tapped, the roar that erupted was both triumphant and mournful, as if the entire arena understood the gravity of what had just unfolded. The new era began in stunned silence, before erupting into a celebration that threatened to crack the rafters. Dricus wasn't just the champion. He was a vindication of every ugly, awkward, relentless moment that brought him here. But glory is a mirror that shows more than victory. It reveals the truth lurking behind triumph. As the belt was wrapped around his waist, there was no childish grin, no satisfied exhale. Instead, his eyes carried the heavy calm of a man who understood that every peak is just another prelude to an even steeper climb. Champions do not rest. They become hunted, dissected, doubted all over again. The world didn't allow fairy tales to rest on happy endings. Dricus knew this intimately. Each contender sharpening knives in the shadows, every critic waiting for the slip that would justify their past scorn. And somewhere Adesanya plotted his own phoenix-like rebirth, his pride stitched together with the same relentless thread that once crowned him king. Dricus welcomed it all, the doubt, the whispers, the inevitable bloody wars to come. He had been molded by skepticism, raised by nights that promised only pain, and in many ways he wore his crown as if it were made of thorns.